All right, so we're going to do part one of interrogation and questioning video notes. So as you watch this, questions will pop up as we go. So this is going to go over the history of interrogation. Just be sure that you get this video done by our Thursday class. That way you're able to fully participate in our activity on Thursday. So we're going to review the history of interrogation. So for this, you'll need to be familiar with a few definitions. So an interrogation is the questioning of a suspect about a crime after they have been placed in custody. So again, these are suspects and they are actually in custody. They've been taken into a police station versus an interview, which is the questioning of a person about a crime when a person is not in custody. So a potential suspect could be interviewed um, before they are placed in custody, but also interviewing can be done with anyone who might have any information about suspects or the events that happened prior to or during a crime. So here is just a brief overview of the history of interrogation. While the dates themselves are not that important, it's going to be familiar to know roughly the order in which these occurred. So way back 1853, New York was the first place to actually have any type of organization of officers who would be considered a police department. So this isn't including way back in the day when they had like the town sheriff. That was not considered a police department. So this was 1853. A group of officers first came together in what would be considered a police department. And then after that time, in the 1850s, late 1850s, police were fairly pressured to obtain confessions from people. Because back in the day, they didn't have any type of fancy forensics. So either they had eyewitnesses who saw a person do a crime, or the person confessed to doing the crime. So there was a lot of pressure on officers to have a person confess. So this is going to be the first time that questions about forceful interrogation tactics arose because these police officers, they're under pressure to get a confession and were doing what it took. And oftentimes that involved very, very forceful tactics, including abuse. So in 1896, there was a court order that stated that in order for a confession to actually be considered in the court, it has to be made freely without any type of coercion. So this is the first time, 1896. So it's been over 100 years ago that they stated that confessions had to be made freely. You couldn't coerce a person into confessing. And then, because of course police officers tried to find a way around that by either threatening violence, a further clarification came out in 1897 that confessions can also not be obtained by threatening someone or using any type of violence. In order to check in on how we were doing, so this is from 1897 to 1931, so 34 years later, the Wickersham report came out. And the Wickersham report, it looked at various reports across the whole United States and the police departments across the United States on how suspects were being interrogated. And what it showed is that there were still lots of third-degree or mental physical techniques being used to gain confessions, even though that there were explicit laws in place that couldn't be done. So they were thinking, after they got this information, the law is still being broken across the country. So the entire country, these tactics are still being used even though they're illegal. So they were starting to think about having to change because here are some of the things that were happening. beating suspects, using weapons against them, limiting the amount of food that they have, limiting how much sleep they had, using spotlights, putting them in small spaces, questioning them for hours and hours on end, physical torture, threatening them or their family. But the really sad thing about this report is it didn't just show that they were being used in a small sample of cases, it showed that they were the primary ones being used to obtain confession, despite laws against it. And so this was really concerning. Um, and as you can see here, they got and analyzed departments across the United States. They tried to get as many as they could from the western states, but they were clustered along the east, but across the entire United States, they had samples. And so this raises the question about why is this problematic? And the reason it's problematic is because if you are using violence, torture, um, playing with people's mental state, so that's what you're doing when you take away food or put them in a small room, limit how much they can eat and sleep. When you are doing this to a person, they're going to be more likely to confess even though they're not guilty. Um, and also it's not ethical, it's not morally right to do this to a person to get them to confess to a crime. So we're going to go through some improvements that have been made since. So again, that report came out in 1931, and there have been improvements to the system. So after the Wickersham report, with the truth exposed, many offices shifted to using more psychological forms of interrogation in place of the physical abuse. So here's an example of that. In 1940, after the Wickersham report came out, they tried to give officers a technique that they could use to interrogate a person without physically abusing them. And it's called the Reed technique. And it essentially used different types of psychology to get a person to confess. And here were the steps that they took. So first, they placed the person in a small room. When they come in, they understate the charges against the person. So they're not fully truthful about how severe the charges are. They explicitly lie about the evidence. They play on their emotions to encourage a confession. So if they have family or young children, well, wouldn't little Timmy be sad if you didn't come home? And this Reed technique was used for over 50 years. And in 2004, there was a study that showed that there were at least 125 cases that used the Reed technique that ended up in false confession. Because again, if you are psychologically manipulating a person, even though you're not actually physically torturing them, but you are manipulating them, using their heart, their feelings, their emotions against them, when you're saying, look, it's not that bad. You confess to this, you'll only get a couple years, you'll get to go home and see your child, things like that. You're flat out lying to them. They're going to be more likely to confess. They confess, and then they end up with severe charges. They're in jail for a long time, and the only reason they actually admitted to it is because you lied. And it's not fair. Some ways that they've started to work around this is in 1966, we came out with the Miranda rights. And this is a series, it came out after 4 different court cases that arose due to improper questioning and interrogation. So this set up explicit rights for an individual, and these have to be read to a person before they talk to be sure that they understand their rights. So here are the Miranda rights. So first you have the right to remain silent. You don't have to say anything. But anything that you do say can be used in a court of law. You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present while you're being questioned. If you can't afford a lawyer, you will get one appointed to you to represent you before questioning if you choose. You can decide to, at any time, exercise these rights and not answer any questions or make statements. So, for instance, if you decide to talk to someone with or without a lawyer present, you can at any time decide from there on out to remain silent. A person has to verbally confirm that they do understand these rights prior to questioning in order for them to actually be used in court. So, if you were not actually read these rights, anything that you say cannot be used against you in a court of law. If you don't verbally say that you understand your rights, again, they can't be used against you. As well as if you are impaired when this happens and they read them, can't be used against you. Anything that you say before you are read and agree to these cannot be used against you in the court of law. They also modified the read technique into a 9-step technique to get rid of the psychological nature that the read technique used. So they changed it up, hoping to limit the number of false confessions. Again, the original read technique is known as the original read technique. This is this 9-step read technique. So this is how the 9-step read technique would go. So prior to step 1, they would leave the suspect alone for a little bit to have some time to think, but also to increase anxiety. We talked about what can happen when your mind can play games and run on you. Any suspect is always being watched during this time, so they get a baseline of your behavior, I suppose, to know what you're like just in your natural state. When the officer does walk into the room, they're going to come in with a folder that contains evidence. Sometimes the amount of papers in said folder may be more than the actual evidence and that's often used to make someone think that you have more evidence than you do against them. The suspect, while they're seated, the officer typically walks up to them holding this folder of evidence while the officer is standing. So they'll confront you standing to give almost a power dynamic. And typically they do not use titles. Now, keep in mind, today in real life, many officers put their own spin on how they approach an interrogation. So this is not how everyone does it. This is just a baseline that can be used to teach people the steps to an interrogation. So step number 1 typically is the interrogator will establish that they believe the suspect is guilty. So you walk in, I know you committed this crime. Then the interrogator states that they are there to figure out why the person did the crime. So I know you did it. I'm just here to figure out why. They anticipate any denials and intercept them. So I know you robbed this house. I just want to know why. And don't say that you didn't. We already know that you were there. You notice any objections that the person has, and you further question them about it. So anything that they say, question them further on that topic. And then you want to catch them by surprise. You want to gain their attention, whether you catch them in a lie or offer up a new piece of evidence. You want to gain their attention. You want to surprise them with something. And then you want to handle their mood. So typically when a suspect's shut down, it kind of represents that they're guilty versus ones that don't shut down. Question 7. You give them an alternative question to the suspect, which is pretty much you give them two scenarios about the how and the whys of the crime. So, for instance, in the case of a burglary, you could say, so did you go into this house because you knew they had something valuable that you wanted, or did you just do it randomly to be spiteful? Something like that. Give them two situations. In both situations, they're guilty, but you're trying to figure out why they committed the crime. In step number 8, we're assuming that if they say they're guilty, you're going to move to step 8 and 9. So in step 8, you get them to tell you the details of the crime, and then in step 9, they have to write it all down. Now, again, this is a baseline process or a list of steps that investigators can use to interrogate someone. After a while, interrogators are going to get their own way of approaching a suspect. It might be different given on the person and how they present. It could be different based on the officer. Some officers will go in and try to really get to know you, to try to establish a connection between the two of you before they even start to talk about a crime. So while this is a technique that was devised and come up with in the later half of the 90s, again, it's not always the primary way that's used. And I know that officers here in the Charlottesville Police Department have said that this is not one that is regularly used there. All right, so that is history of interrogation. Make sure you watch this again prior to Wednesday, and that way you're ready for your timeline.